The first officer noticed it at 4 inches the morning, and he noticed it because it made no sense. The night patrol around the private apartments had been quietly doubled without any request logged through the usual channels. A second checkpoint had appeared at the base of the grand staircase, manned by 2 protection officers who did not belong to the king's usual detail at all, but to a unit normally reserved for state visits and coronations. Nobody had told the overnight household why. Nobody that night was going to be told anything at all. By 6:30, the story had already begun the way these stories always began now, not with a statement, but with an absence. The palace's own accounts, usually posting a routine good morning image by that hour, said nothing. Rolling News, which had learned over the past year to treat that particular silence as its own kind of alarm, began circling before a single fact had been confirmed. At 6:51, the ticker turned. Breaking major palace activity overnight, Delaware tales unknown. Producers who had spent 5 separate mornings this year tearing up running orders for this family did it again, this time with the particular weariness of people who suspected, correctly, that whatever was coming would be bigger than anything that had come before it. Inside in the Regency room, a chamber that had not, within living institutional memory, been used for the purpose its name implied, the heavy doors had been bolted from within. For the first time since anyone on the current household staff could recall, the Prime Minister sat at the edge of a stiff-backed chair, his red box untouched on his knees. The Archbishop of Canterbury studied the grain of the table rather than the faces around it. Princess Anne sat with the flat, contained stillness of a woman who had already read every document on the table twice before anyone else arrived. Edward stood near the window, arms folded, saying nothing, because there was, for once, nothing useful left to say. At the head of the table sat King Charles. Beside him, closer than protocol strictly required, sat Prince William, and on William's face was an expression none of them had ever seen him wear before, not grief exactly, and not fear exactly, but the particular blankness of a man being handed something whole decades before he had let himself believe he would have to carry it. The document on the table was not a restructuring order. It was not another quiet redistribution of duties. It was, in the oldest and plainest language the Constitution possessed, the instrument of regency, the legal mechanism, invoked only a handful of times in the monarchy's entire modern history, by which a reigning sovereign's active powers pass, formally and completely, to an heir, while the crown itself remains where it has always been. Charles was not abdicating. He wanted that understood, and had said so twice already that night, as much to himself as to the room. But from the moment his pen touched that page, every audience with the Prime Minister, every red box, every act of state that required a sovereign's daily hand, would pass to William, not eventually, not as a plan for some year down the line tonight. And the one person in the entire building who did not know any of this was, at that exact moment, walking down the corridor toward that door. Camilla had been told by her own private secretary that the king was holding an unscheduled late session with the chancellor about the coming budget, a lie, constructed by Charles himself 3 days earlier, specifically so that she would not learn what was happening until it was already done. In the months since the council room and the locksmiths and the boxes carried out of her study, she had rebuilt a great deal of her old rhythm inside the narrower space she'd been left with. And one of the things she had rebuilt without anyone quite deciding to let her was a habit of knowing, almost by instinct now, when something in that building was being kept from her. She reached the checkpoint outside the Regency room, and the officer stepped forward with the particular respectful firmness reserved for people who have been given one instruction and told there will be no exceptions to it. He explained that His Majesty had asked that the room not be entered. Camilla did not argue with him. She had learned over 3 decades in that house exactly which battles were won with words and which were won with silence, and she chose silence now. She reached past him and closed her hand around the brass handle. It did not move. The small, useless rattle of it echoed down the empty corridor, and inside the room every head turned very slightly toward the sound, though nobody said anything. William closed his eyes for half a second. Charles did not look up. He pressed the pen to the vellum and signed his name, and the future of the institution changed shape before the sound of the handle had even finished dying away in the corridor outside. It had not happened overnight. Nothing in that family ever did. 3 weeks earlier, at a state banquet for a visiting head of government, Charles had lost the thread of his own toast. Midway through the second paragraph, a small thing, invisible to most of the room, the kind of pause any tired man of his age might have. Camilla, seated beside him, had filled it before it could become a silence anyone noticed finishing his sentence in her own voice with such practiced warmth that the cameras caught nothing but a devoted wife leaning in to share a private joke. The newspapers had called it charming. Inside the family, it had caused something closer to panic, because it was not the first time, only the first time anyone outside the household had come close to seeing it. What followed was not, in Camilla's own mind, a betrayal of anything. She had simply done what she had always done, absorbed what she could, quietly, so the weight on him would be lighter. She began taking meetings that once would have waited for him. She began adjusting the pace of his diary without always telling his private secretary why. She began, in small, well-intentioned increments, standing between her husband and the exhausting machinery of the state he was sworn to carry because she loved him, and because she had watched, decades earlier, what that machinery did to people it decided to grind down in public. And she had promised herself she would never let it happen to him the way it had happened to others she'd watched suffer. Anne saw it first, because Anne always saw it first. She did not believe, even now, that Camilla had acted from anything as simple as ambition. She believed, more precisely and more painfully, that Camilla had acted from fear, the old fear, the one that had never fully left her since the years of waiting outside gates that would not open. If Charles faded, what remained for her? A title without weight, a past without a future attached to it. So she had tried, without ever quite naming it to herself, to make herself indispensable to the machinery itself, so that no one could imagine the reign continuing smoothly without her in the room. Anne assembled the evidence the same way she had assembled it once before, patiently, without cruelty, because cruelty had never been the point. Altered schedules, meetings taken without record, a canceled medical evaluation quietly rebooked as a private consultation instead, private secretaries who had begun, without quite admitting it to each other, reporting information to the Queen Consort before it reached the king. She laid all of it in front of her brother on a gray Sunday afternoon at Windsor, and she told him the plain, unbearable truth of what it added up to. Not a wife protecting a husband, but an unelected consort quietly beginning to govern in his name, and a fragile, aging king whose decline was being hidden from the very institution he was sworn to serve. Honestly, Charles had read it in silence, the way he always read the worst things twice through before he allowed himself to feel anything about it. He was not angry, not at first. What he felt, reading it, was something closer to recognition, the particular vertigo of seeing, in someone else's careful concealment, the shape of his own oldest fear reflected back at him. He had spent his whole life terrified of becoming a burden the institution had to quietly work around. Now the person who loved him most had built exactly that arrangement for him, out of love, and it frightened him more than anything Anne's folder could have said outright. So he had decided in the small hours that followed on the Regency, not as punishment, though he knew it would land as one, but as the only honest answer available to a man who could no longer pretend his stamina and his sovereignty were the same thing. He would not hide his decline behind his wife's quiet management of it. He would name it, formally, publicly, and hand the daily weight of the crown to the one person for whom carrying it had always been the plan. When the door was finally unlocked, 10 minutes after the pen had lifted from the page, the Prime Minister and the Archbishop filed out past Camilla, with bows that felt, to her, unmistakably different from the ones she'd received that same morning, not the bows owed to the wife of a reigning active sovereign, but something more careful, more ceremonial, the bow owed to history rather than to power. She stepped past them into the room. William stood beside the table, holding a sealed red leather box bearing the sovereign's gold cipher. Not Charles, William. Camilla looked at the box, then at William, then finally at her husband. For the first time in 3 decades of surviving nearly everything that country could throw at her, the scorn, the headlines, the decades of being told she did not belong, she found herself standing in the center of a room with absolutely nothing to say. "You locked me out," she said finally when the words came back to her, and her voice did not shake the way she had expected it to. It came out flat and cold and far more devastating for its flatness. "I did," Charles said. He did not look away from her. "Because if I had told you what I intended, you would have spent 3 days trying to talk me out of it, and I no longer have 3 days to spare arguing about whether I am allowed to admit what has been happening to me." "What has been happening to you," she repeated, "is something I have been managing so that this family would never have to face a moment like this one. And you have repaid that by treating me like a conspirator in my own home." William set the dispatch box down gently on the table. said nothing, and stepped toward the door with the particular tact of a man who understood exactly which conversations were not his to referee. He paused only long enough to look at his father, and then at Camilla, with an expression that carried no triumph in it at all, only a tired, genuine sorrow at the cost of a night he had not asked to be handed. Then he left them alone. "I was not managing your decline," Camilla said when the door had closed. "I was protecting your dignity. There is a difference." "There was once," Charles said quietly. "I'm no longer certain there still is. You canceled a medical evaluation, Camilla. You rebooked it as a private consultation, so it would never appear on any official record. You began taking meetings the Chancellor's office believed were mine. At what point does protecting a man's dignity become quietly governing in his place?" She did not answer immediately. The accusation landed somewhere she had clearly, on some level already known it would eventually land. And the not answering was, in its own way, an admission. "I was afraid," she said finally, and the coldness in her voice finally cracked open into something raw. "I have spent my whole life afraid of exactly this moment, the one where you become smaller and slower and less certain, and the country decides it no longer needs to make room for me at all. I told myself I was protecting you. Some of that was true, but I think I was also protecting the only version of myself I know how to be, the woman standing beside the king, useful, indispensable, impossible to remove. I did not know how to be anything else. I still don't." Charles was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and drew out a small, worn brass key, the same one he had given her months earlier in the glass house, at dawn after the last order that had stripped something from her. "This still opens the same drawer," he said. "Nothing about that has changed tonight, whatever else has. The Regency moves the boxes to William. It does not move anything that was ever between us into his hands. I need you to hear that distinction, even tonight, even now, because I think it is the only thing standing between this being an ending and this being simply another difficult chapter. You have made me irrelevant," she said, "to the state, to the machinery, to everything I spent 30 years fighting to be allowed near." "I have made myself irrelevant to it," Charles said. "That is what tonight actually is, if you can bear to look at it plainly. I am not stripping you of anything. I have not first stripped from myself. William holds the box now because I am no longer certain, some mornings, that I can hold it safely. That is not a decision about you. It only felt like one because you had already quietly made yourself the person standing between me and that truth." Camilla looked at the key in his open palm for a long time before she took it. She did not thank him for it. She did not apologize for the canceled evaluation, or the redirected meetings, or the months of careful, loving concealment that had brought them to this room. But she took the key and closed her fingers around it, and something in her shoulders, which had been rigid since the moment the handle refused to turn beneath her hand, finally, slightly eased. "I am not ready to forgive tonight," she said. "I want you to know that plainly, so there is no confusion about it later." "I'm not asking you to," Charles said. "I'm only asking you not to leave the room believing that everything between us was decided by lawyers in the last 6 hours. Some of it was, not all of it. By the time the palace released its statement, just after 7, the country had already spent the better part of an hour speculating without a single confirmed fact to work from. Breaking King Charles invokes Regency Act, Prince William to assume sovereign duties. The careful language that followed spoke of continuity, of a king's desire to guide the transition of the crown while still present to oversee it, of decades of precedent behind the mechanism now, for the first time in living memory, actually being used. It said nothing at all about Camilla, and the absence of her name in a statement of that size became, within the hour, a story in itself. In a hairdresser's in Leeds, the radio bulletin cut through a conversation about half-term holidays, and the whole salon went quiet for a moment before someone said, "So he's still king. He's just not doing king things anymore." Her client, foil still in her hair, shrugged. "Sounds like retirement with better security." In a taxi rank outside Paddington, 2 drivers argued over what it meant for the woman who wasn't mentioned at all. "That's the real story," one said. "Not the Regency, the silence where she should be." The other shook his head. "Maybe there's nothing to say. Maybe for once this isn't about her." In a students' union bar in Manchester, someone pulled up the full text of the constitutional instrument on their phone and read the technical definition of Regency aloud to a table that had, until that moment, been discussing something else entirely. "It's not abdication," she said. "It's bigger than that, weirdly. He's still king. He's just handed over everything that makes being king actually mean anything. In a care home in Norfolk, the same retired civil servant who had weighed in on every chapter of the story so far lowered his newspaper and said to the nurse pouring his tea, "I've seen 3 regencies discussed in my lifetime and never once seen one used. Whatever's happening in that family, it's not theater anymore." And outside the palace gates, the crowd that gathered that morning was larger than it had been in months, and far quieter than any of them the particular hush of a country, trying to work out whether it had just watched an old man's humility or an old man's fear. At Kensington, William sat with the dispatch box still unopened on the desk in front of him, Catherine beside him, neither of them speaking for a long while. "He didn't ask if I was ready," William said finally. "Were you going to say no if he had?" Catherine asked. "No," he admitted, "but I would have liked to have been asked anyway." "There will be no celebration," Catherine said before he could say it himself, because by now the rule had become instinct rather than instruction. "No triumphant photographs, no language that makes tonight look like something we wanted." "Because it isn't," William said. "It's the thing I always knew was coming, arriving on a Tuesday I wasn't prepared for, at an hour I was asleep for." He finally opened the box. The first paper inside required nothing more complicated than a signature, and yet his hand hovered over it longer than the moment strictly demanded. He broke something in that room tonight, not just with her, with himself. Anne asked for comment as she left the building near dawn, gave the same precise, unbothered nod she always gave when she had nothing she intended to say publicly, and walked on. She had done, once again, the hardest and least visible work of the entire night, the work of forcing a truth into a room that would rather not have looked at it, and she had never once expected thanks for it, and did not look for any now. That evening, long after the statements had been issued, and the analysts had exhausted every available theory, Charles came to Camilla's drawing room, as he had done every evening for months, without sending word ahead. She opened the door herself. The tea was already made. They did not speak, at first, about the Regency, or the locked door, or the folder Anne had carried into Windsor weeks earlier. Camilla set the brass key on the table between them, not returning it, simply placing it where they could both see it. "I keep thinking," she said, "that tonight should have felt like the end of something. The end of 30 years of fighting to matter in this house." "Does it?" "No," she admitted, and the admission seemed to cost her something real. "It feels like the first night in a very long time that you told me the truth about yourself, before I had to go looking for it in a folder someone else compiled." She looked at him properly for the first time since the corridor. "I am still angry that you locked the door." "I know. I am not sure that anger is going anywhere soon." "I'm not asking it to," Charles said. "I only needed you to still be in this room when it finally left." She reached for his hand not because the anger had gone, but because it had, for the moment, stopped being the only thing in the room. Outside, the institution moved forward exactly as it always did. The boxes now traveling to a different desk, the succession no longer a matter of some distant future, but of tomorrow morning's diary, the machinery of the crown entirely indifferent to what it had cost, the two people sitting quietly by the window to keep it turning without breaking. The country would spend days deciding what to call what had happened a sacrifice, a surrender, the bravest thing a king had done in a generation, or simply the oldest fear in that family finally admitted out loud. But in that small room, away from every ticker and every camera, there was no need to decide anything at all. There was only a king who had, for once, told the truth before it could be discovered for him, and a queen who had not forgiven him yet, and had not left either. And between those two unfinished things, the marriage, battered and honest and still standing, went on.